Okay, they're still here, so whoever wants. Marge, did you want one? You got one? Okay. Anyone else? Quarterly? Oh, you have one? Good. I have some more up here, so as people come, please let me know and let them know that there are some here still in the to give out. And I use the online app to do my study. How was everybody's week? Good? Busy? Yeah. Oh, true. Very busy, actually. A lot of the what? Oh, crazy. A lot of actions and activities for the Piñero family. Not only mine, but my kids' families too. Zach and Nico, my sons. So a lot of activity this week. This summer is going to be a very busy one for us, with a lot of transition, and you'll hear about most of it shortly. Before we get into our lesson this morning, and I will tell you that the more I read this lesson, the more I find stuff to talk about. We will never be able to cover it all. So we're going to get through it as quick as we possibly can, because I do want to cover as much as I can. And please remind me that if the time is running short, and it usually does, I need to get to the last slide. Whatever happens, I'll skip through the rest of the slides, but I need to get to the last slide before we're done, okay? And the reason why is because that is an important slide to me and what the lesson means to me personally. I think the story of Joseph is a great story, but I think there's a lot of other stuff there that I think we don't pay attention to us in our day and age in 2022. So, any prayer requests before we get into our lesson this morning? Prayer requests, thanks. Yes, ma'am. Healing, okay. Yes, a lot of people with healings. People still sick out there, of course. Yes. Okay, ooh, they're coming out, huh? Have they been here before? Okay. Traveling mercies and healings, of course. Yes. Difficulty? Something happens. Yeah, the devil doesn't want us to do that, right? Yeah. The devil loves to try to interfere our path to the Savior. So, okay. All right. Let's have a word of prayer. Father, we thank you so much for the Sabbath day. We thank you for the break that we can from our busy activities and our busy week, and just come and rest in your hands. As we open your word this morning, we ask for your Spirit that it may be present, that we may learn a little bit more about your love and your grace through the life of Joseph and his family. We have a few prayer requests this morning. We pray for traveling mercies as family members are traveling to come and visit. We ask for healing. There are so many people who are still sick out there with COVID and other things. We ask that you heal them according to your will. We also ask for your grace for people who are trying to get to you and are walking toward you, and the devil just wants to hinder them. Help them see you. Grab them by their hand and make their travel a success as they bring their lives to you. And help us always as we walk together to walk with you. Thank you for your Spirit request in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay, Joseph, Prince of Egypt, Lesson 12. I put two things underneath that I thought were interesting to me. This is the birth of Zaphenath-Paneah. Do you know who that is, by the way? I thought it was kind of interesting. Yeah, Zaphenath-Paneah is actually Joseph's Egyptian name. It's the name Pharaoh gave him when he made him the second in command. Has a meaning of its own, and so I will bring that later. And of course, how the tides have turned. Okay? All of a sudden, Joseph, the little spoiled boy who was really disliked by his brothers, sold into slavery, and now he's the second in command. Boy, oh boy. Do things change, and how dramatic. We left off last week in chapter 41 where Joseph interpreted the king's dreams, right? Pharaoh's dreams of the fat cows and the fat ears of corn and so on and so forth. And the lesson stopped there, so we're going to pick up the story right at that point. This week's lesson will finish with chapter 41, and it goes all the way through chapter 44. I will tell you we're not going to read all the chapters. I'm just going to try to touch bases on each one and certain points. And remember, if you're in my class, please bring up questions, comments. I love it when we talk. But we are going to go through that. All right. I found this quote, Oprah Winfrey, by the way. What do you think? True forgiveness is when you can say thank you for that experience. Wow. True forgiveness is when you can say thank you for that experience. Is that a tough one? How hard is it to forgive, particularly when you were wronged? So I'm going to ask a quick question based on this. Did Joseph forgive his brothers? That's a trick question, by the way. All right, you know me, questions. And we have mics around, so if somebody wants to talk, just things to think about while we study the lesson. Number one, do we fully understand the family dynamics in Jacob's home? I will mention briefly, last week we could not cover the scenario with Reuben and Tamar. Maybe I'll touch on it really quickly, but that's an interesting dynamic. And I think Brother Bernard mentioned last week that, the family dynamics of Jacob's home are really interesting. Do we really fully understand those? 2, is the story of Joseph solely about him? My wife and I were talking about this last night. Great rag to riches story, but is the story of Joseph in Genesis solely about Joseph? Because I think we make a mistake if we only concentrate on Joseph, we miss a lot. I put Acts 7:9 on there because the last week's lesson mentioned that verse. I thought it was interesting what that verse says. That verse actually refers to Joseph's brothers as patriarchs. Did you read that? Yeah, look it up. It refers to Joseph's brothers as patriarchs, and when I think of patriarchs, I don't think of Joseph's brothers. But that's interesting. Number 3, who was at fault with what happened to Joseph? Another trick question. Who was ultimately responsible for what Joseph went through? Number 4, what is the spiritual meaning of Joseph's story in Egypt? And there are a few. Quite a few, actually. Number 5, what was attractive about Joseph's success? His fortune, his fame, his glory. Is that what's attractive about Joseph's story? What happens if Joseph was never made Prince of Egypt? Was his story be less attractive? Yes or no? Interesting. Was Joseph's purpose or mission in Egypt to save the remnant? That one is another one. Was Joseph's only mission was to save the remnant or beyond that? And number 7, in the end, was Joseph guilty of repeating Jacob's mistake? What do I mean by that? What was Jacob's mistake in Joseph's life? We talked about it extensively last week. What was Jacob guilty of? Of what?
Favoritism.
We blame Jacob for everything. Well, we always talk about that Jacob spoiled Joseph, correct? Yeah. He just signaled Joseph out from the rest of his brothers. And so in the end, I just had a question. Was Joseph guilty of repeating Jacob's mistake? It's kind of interesting. You guys are thinking, huh? Memory verse. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, "See, I set you over all the land of Egypt." And this is ending chapter 41, which is where we left off last week. Genesis 41:41. I want to briefly mention this. Like I said, I'm going through some slides quickly. For those of you who don't know, Joseph actually means may he, or God, add. And in particular, sons. Remember, he was waiting so long for Rachel to have kids. Finally, he has Joseph, and so this is what Joseph means. Zaphanath-Paneah is his name in Egypt, and that's what it means. Very powerful meaning, by the way. The God speaks, and he lives. How many gods does Egypt believe in? Many gods. However, Pharaoh deemed that he should name Joseph the God speaks and he lives. That's impressive from a very pagan ruler. But that was his given name. Before we go into the story, of course, now today we're going to discuss Joseph and the brothers coming to Egypt after the famine starts. Just going to briefly mention Tamar and Reuben. What happened in that story? What was the whole issue beyond? And my important question is, why is that story even in Genesis? With all this beautiful story of Joseph and his brothers and being sold for 20 pieces of silver, whatever, why mention this story? You remember the story, right? Or do you want us to go over it real quick?
I think for two reasons. The first is that Judah ended up being the patriarch that would produce the seed that had been promised all the way down from the time of Abraham. And it's unusual for someone who had that role would find himself in the circumstances in which he did in that story. And the second thing that I thought was unusual, well, not unusual, but different up until this point in the story, he married someone who was not within the family. This is the first time because Isaac was sent. Abraham sent his servant to find a wife for Isaac, and then Isaac found a wife for Jacob in the family and so forth. But this was the first time that somebody in that line married somebody who was from another. Well, actually, she was pagan. She was a pagan person. She was not in that line, and that was unusual too.
Okay.
And I think it was the story is there to show again how gracious God is, how accepting God is, and how he has a way of bringing about his plan, his will from the most unusual circumstances.
Okay. Anyone else? Angela.
Reuben was the firstborn,
Mm-hmm.
and the firstborn was usually given the birthright, and with the birthright came rights and privileges with it. And because of what he did, he forfeited that position.
Okay. Okay. Go ahead.
Did he forfeit it? Because
Did he forfeit it?
Mhm.
Okay.
But he was still blessed.
Okay. Now, I'm talking about what he did with his daughter-in-law. Is that what we're talking about? Okay. What happened between him and his daughter-in-law? What was the whole purpose of this? It's because this story fascinates me. It's in the middle of all this Joseph story. Why mention that? Okay, so basically what happened in a gist is that Reuben has 3 kids, right? And they all get married. Is the oldest. He gets married. But I thought it was interesting that in Genesis it says that God actually killed because he was what? He was wicked. All right? So God actually killed him. So all of a sudden his wife...
You used Jacob or somebody, Reuben or somebody, but you mean Jacob.
Yes.
Judah, I'm sorry.
I'm sorry, yes, yeah. So what happens when the son dies? Evidently, his wife is now no children. What was the rule back then? Yes. It's called the levirate rule. It was the Jewish law of levirate, which means if two brothers work together, they have to work together, by the way. They're in the same company or the same group together. One of the wives dies. One of the brothers dies. The other brother is responsible for the wife. Okay, they actually have to have relations and have children to continue the legacy. So what happened in this case? They promised her one of the brothers, but the brother didn't fulfill it, and then evidently they forgot the promise, and then wife dies of the father-in-law. He goes out to meet with some woman, and she decides to fool him and sleep with her father-in-law to fulfill the promise. Why is that story there? Interesting, huh? I don't even know if they still follow the levirate rule, which is an interesting rule, right? Why? Why mention that? And I'm going to just go on from there because I think it's important to know, and that's one of my first questions was, what was the family dynamics in Jacob's home? And it's kind of funny how Jacob's son literally gives her the right of way. She says she was correct in what she did. I was wrong, she was right. But you'd think of it on face value, what she did is really kind of what? Tricky, isn't it? She's tricking her father-in-law. But he says she was correct. Why? Why was he wrong? Okay? And this is something that I'm going to mention briefly because it goes into what Joseph does with his brothers. Okay? He was responsible for her. He had made a vow, and it was his responsibility as the head of the home to take care of the people below him. He did not do that. He did not do what he was supposed to do. And I always have a question that Cain always asked God in chapter 4 of this very same book of Genesis. He looked at God and asked God what when he killed his brother? Am I my brother's keeper? And the answer to that, starting in Genesis, is what? Yes, you are responsible for your brother. And I'm not talking about blood here either. As Christians, you are responsible for everyone that God has put in front of you as your brother. That's what he didn't do. So now let's go forward, and now we got Joseph, right? Now Joseph is now, and let's review a few things. Now he makes him the second in command, right? What's the first thing that he gives him? He gives him a wife, which I thought was interesting. Who's Joseph's wife? We never talk about her. Do you remember? Asenath. Very good. That's her name, Asenath. Who was Asenath? The daughter of one of the priests of Egypt. Interesting. So we're talking about we don't want to mix and match our marriages between people that are not. Joseph's a Hebrew, and he marries an Egyptian priest's daughter. They have 2 kids, right? What are the kids' names? And Ephraim. Do those names sound familiar? If you know your Israelic tribes, they are 2 of the 12 tribes of Israel. Joseph didn't have a tribe, but his sons did. Manasseh and Ephraim both were tribes. Yep, they were both tribes of Israel. So kind of interesting how even God used that scenario in his plan. And if you haven't noticed in this lesson, all of Genesis, God has a plan. And he is going to make his plan come true independently of how much we mess it up along the line. And Joseph's story is classic. Okay? So now, Joseph is second in command. We go into chapter 42. Oh, this is 41 at the end. After Joseph interprets the dream, this is what Pharaoh says. The proposal pleased Pharaoh and all his servants. Pharaoh said to his servants, "Come, can we find anyone else like this?" Listen what Pharaoh describes Joseph. One in whom is the Spirit of God. Hence why he named them Zaphanath-Paneah. By the way, does that sound common, that phrase? Does that sound familiar? What did Potiphar say of Joseph when he started working in his house? He noticed that the Lord was with Joseph. Everywhere Joseph went, they said the same thing. There is a God that's with this guy. So Pharaoh said to Joseph, "Since God has shown you all this, there is no one as discerning and wise as you. You shall be over my house, and all of my people shall order themselves as you command." So now Joseph's in charge. "Only with regard to the throne will I be greater than you." And Pharaoh said to Joseph, "See, I have set you over all the land of Egypt." That's our memory verse. Now, why it is significant about the next phrase that I underlined. Removing his signet ring from his hand, Pharaoh put it on Joseph's hand. He arrayed him in garments of fine linen and put a gold chain around his neck. What does that remind you of?
The lost son, prodigal son.
Prodigal son, very good. Ooh, I like that. Yeah, okay. What else? Who else clothed Joseph? His father gave him a coat of many colors with long sleeves. However, now that was a preamble to what Pharaoh did. Now Pharaoh dresses him up just like Jacob did. Okay? So now we go to 42. How old was Joseph when he took over as Pharaoh's second in command? Bible says
30.
he was 32 years old, right? So now at the age of 32, and he was probably how old when they sold him? About 17 years old. So we're talking about 13 plus years, 15 years or so now has gone by. He's 32. Now, here's the key. It says that after that famine, the 7 years of plenty occurred, right? So when the 7 years of plenty were over, how old was he now? Math. He's 39. But Jacob did not send his sons till after the effects, right, of the famine. So famine should have started. So I'm assuming, and we can calculate that Joseph was now about 40 or 41 years old when 42 starts. Because here it says, when Jacob learned that there was grain in Egypt, he said to his sons, "Why do you keep looking at one another? I have heard," he said, "that there is grain in Egypt. Go down and buy grain from there, that we may live and not die." So now that the famine set in, the 7 years, he sends his sons to Egypt. And now our famous story starts. Okay? So now Joseph has been gathering grain for 7 years. He's been feeding everybody for about a year or two, and now Jacob says, "You got to go and get some food. We're hungry." You know the story from here, right? Okay, 10 sons go to Egypt. What happens? Who is the only one distributing food? Joseph is distributing food, which, by the way, if you read things well, is a sign of a true leader. Joseph, as most leaders do, they stayed in their office and send people to do their job. True leaders don't. True leaders do the job themselves and lead others to do it. Joseph is distributing the food, by the way. He doesn't have to, but he does. So all of a sudden he sees what? He sees these 10 guys, and it's kind of interesting. He recognizes them, but they don't recognize him. Why is that? Yeah, okay. Joseph doesn't look like he did when he left. They look about the same because they're still in the desert, still shepherds, still tend their sheep and dusty and whatever. Joseph looks totally different now. He's got his Egyptian attire, his headdress. He probably has one of those famous goatees that they showed King Tut had and all this kind of stuff. So they don't recognize him. Plus, he's 40 years old. He was a teenager when they saw him last. I can tell you for sure, I changed since I was a teenager. Okay? I had hair then. See, look at you. Yeah. So they come up to Joseph and he recognizes them and he starts this ball rolling of this plan. So he starts to accuse them that you're spies coming to spy on the land. So I thought it was interesting. I included here verse 11 of chapter 42. Listen to what his brothers answer him. We are all sons of one man. We are what? Your servants have never been spies. Are these honest men? And look at who they're telling them to. They don't know it, but they're telling Joseph that they're honest men. And if I was Joseph, and I'm not, thank goodness, I would have been saying, honest? Are you kidding me? Because after all of these years, his father does not know that he's alive. They lied to Jacob. And they continue to lie. But they say, we're honest men. Sure we are. Go ahead. Good. Say it out loud, because that's the next point I was going to come to.
I was just going to say that I think at this point they were honest men. They had changed because of the experience they had, what they had done to Joseph, and they had suffered that for years. And I think they were honest men who were ready for exposure.
Yeah.
Clear
They were ready. Okay, and that's very true. Very possible. They might have been honest at the time, but before, remember, we as humans don't forget anything. Joseph might have said, okay, you're honest men, but are you really? Because I know what you did. So this is where the ball starts to roll in Joseph's head. Okay, how do I prove these guys that are honest or not? Have they changed?
He continued to test them, and bringing Benjamin down was one way, and then by providing Benjamin with more food and grain and so on like that when he was there in Joseph's house, he provided him with a lot more favoritism. And he also said, by the way, he also arranged everybody in order of birth.
Yeah. That we're going to get into that too. All of that dynamics is easy. This isn't the first visit. Remember, the brothers came twice. This is the first one. And here's how the brothers talk to each other when Joseph treats them this way. He says, alas, we are paying the penalty for what we did to our brother. We saw his anguish when he pleaded with us, but we would not listen. This is why this anguish has come upon us. So now they are reaping what they sow in their minds. Okay?
Not so much in their minds, because this is what they were saying among each other, and Joseph he knew what they were, he was hearing.
Well, they probably said it out loud, because remember, Joseph only talked to them in Egyptian.
That's right.
He used an interpreter. So every time have you ever done that? I know we've done it. I speak Spanish fluently. And you have the bad habit that if someone's around and you want to talk about them, you talk in Spanish, right? Oh, nobody knows, right? Of course, I've been burnt by that before, because the least person you think is all of a sudden answers you back in Spanish, and you go, ooh. Teaches you a lesson. Don't talk about anybody, period. But Joseph talked to them through an interpreter. So they thought he didn't know Hebrew. So Joseph is spying on them incredibly. So I like this, because Reuben answers here, and then Reuben says, didn't I tell you not to wrong the boy, but you would not listen. So now there comes a reckoning for his blood. So what's Reuben doing?
Blaming.
What?
The blaming game.
Yeah, ever since the Garden of Eden, humans always blame somebody else. So Reuben is telling you, I told you so, but you wouldn't listen to me. Why is his comment not valid? Why is his comment not valid? Again, who is Reuben? Reuben is the oldest. Guess what? In this culture, the oldest voice is rules. You're the oldest. Everyone should listen to you. You can't say, well, I told you so, but you did your own thing. That means you didn't do your job. And again, he didn't do his responsibility. He was responsible for his brothers as the oldest, and he didn't do his job. But he's blaming them now. By the way, you can't blame anybody for your sins. That's your responsibility. You choose to sin or not to sin. The devil made me do it doesn't work. The devil can tempt you, but it's your choice. Reuben had control over that from the moment they wanted to do and hurt his brother, but he did not take responsibility. So now he's making an excuse. Yeah. Oh, Joe, go ahead.
I think that's very interesting as we look at this whole story, as we look at the lessons of the past and his father, and the deception that went on regularly, including with the oldest children, those that should have had the birthright, and the responsibility they took or didn't take. And it's interesting as we think about Joseph here. He was probably very different looking to the brothers with the makeup.
Oh, yeah.
And the clothing and everything else that was so different for them. But the amazing thing with this whole story that I really didn't capture until this week and last week's lesson. And I love the story of Joseph. Believe me.
Everybody does. It's a great story.
There's a connection with the name.
Very good.
But when you look at this again is an example of the gift of salvation, the gift of forgiveness, the gift of atonement. To no matter what we have done to Jesus, he is working to save us. This plan came out long before there was famine.
Mm-hmm.
Joseph at 17 was put in the place he needed to be at the age of 40 or 41. Jesus was the same, except Jesus was our perfect example and our perfect salvation. But there again is a connection in this story to our personal salvation.
You know what's important? I mean, like I said, there's so many little points and spiritual points in the story that you cannot overlook. So, for example, for all intensive purposes, just to give you an example, for all intensive purposes, like Joseph said, Joseph was, to the eyes of Jacob's sons, Joseph was what? By looking at his appearance, what was he? He was Egyptian, so he was pagan. So based on what you saw of Joseph, he looked like every other pagan in Egypt. Who was more attached to God than they were themselves? Joseph. Never judge a book by its cover. You don't know what's inside. Ever. Okay? That's important. So here's this Egyptian guy, and yet he was the one that God was using throughout the whole story. So you know the story, right? He accuses them of being spies. He puts them in prison for 3 days, takes them back out, and then says, well, you know what? Just to prove you're not spies, I want 10 of you to go back, or 9 of you to go back, and I want you to bring back your younger brother to see if what you're telling me is true. So he keeps Simeon, right? So he keeps Simeon, and then the brothers go back. So when their brother comes back, now they got to tell their father what's going on. Okay, now, I don't know about you, but if I were the brothers, I would have not wanted to face my father. Okay? Already did something to him years ago. Now I have to give him bad news again. Right? So they come up to him, and this is how Jacob responds. You know, and their father Jacob said to them, I am the one you have bereaved of children. Joseph is no more, so he still doesn't know. And now Simeon is no more, so he already counted Simeon out. And now you want to take Benjamin. So now you're asking me to give my youngest son away, the last one remaining of Rachel. I've lost Joseph, I lost Simeon. Now, so he finally says, no, you're not going to go, and I'm not sending him. Look at the way Reuben answers. Did Reuben learn his lesson? This is a heavy statement. Then Reuben said to his father, you may kill my 2 sons if I do not bring him back to you. Wow. This was heavy for Reuben. Put him in my hands, and I will bring him back to you. But of course, Jacob says no. However, you got 43. Food was still gone, and now they're hungry again. So finally, Jacob says, you know what? I've got to feed my family because he is the patriarch. I've got to take care of my family. They've got to eat. Okay, I am going to concede. Okay? So he tells them, if it must be so, then do this. Take some of the choice fruits of our land in your bags and carry them down to present to this man. And some of the things that they wanted. So they go back to Egypt. Now they have Benjamin, right? Oh, no, yeah, I know, but we're going to talk about that. So now they go back, and this is the famous scene where they come back with Benjamin. And when they come back, you remember the story, right? They had put all their money back. Joseph put all the money back, and they told their father, they gave us all the money back. And so they came back, and so when they get him there and they take him to the house. Now, Joseph actually invites them to his home to eat. The brothers talk to the servants there. Do you remember that conversation? They're trying to excuse themselves, say, you know what? We found our money back in our sacks when we got home. I don't know how it got there. Please excuse us. Look at what the answers of Joseph's servants said. He tells the brothers, rest assured, do not be afraid. Your God and the God of your father must have put the treasure in the sacks for you. Okay, now this is another Egyptian. Why did he say that? Interesting for an Egyptian to say this. Do not be afraid. Your God and the God of your father must have put treasures in your sacks for you. Why? Sid and then Angela.
My thought is that Joseph's influence on his servants, being a man of God, in everything he did and everything he said, was why they knew of the God of Israel.
Okay.
He was the steward of Joseph, and he was the one who put them in there.
Okay. Oh, I know that. But why not tell him that he put it in? He says, God of your fathers. Why not say, I put it in? I know. I did it.
The servant at this point, we don't know.
No, absolutely.
If he had some relationship with Joseph, we know that Joseph, being the kind of person he was, that this would have been an honest servant of Joseph's. But the story doesn't tell us that the servants or even by anybody in Joseph's household was aware at this point that this was Joseph's family.
Oh, no, yeah, that's true, because later on we'll read that when Joseph exploded and started to cry, they told Pharaoh, hey, you know what? His brothers are here, and he's so happy to see them. But I thought it was curious that the servant, and I agree with Sid, whether Sid and I are right or wrong or not. Joseph had been the ruler of Egypt now for over 7 years. Don't tell me that a man who did so much for Potiphar's house did not impress his own household as to the God he served. Potiphar knew it. Pharaoh knew it. Why wouldn't his household? There was something about Joseph that everyone knew was different than everyone else. And they were willing to say, it's got to be the God that gave him the dream. Remember, everybody knew that this was the guy who interpreted Pharaoh's dream. It had to be known all over the land. So somehow they knew that Joseph's God was a special God. And I don't mind saying that Joseph made that much of an influence on the people that came around him. What is the influence that you and I have to people around us? Do people say of us, man, the God that Elliot serves is really special, and I want a piece of that? Independently of where Joseph was. He was in a pagan land. Daniel was in Babylon. And yet, in that environment, God worked through them and they made an influence. For those of you who, I'm going to get there before I even get to the last slide because it's too good. Okay? It's too good. The story, what Joe said earlier about salvation, is so important. The story of salvation in Joseph's life was not just about Joseph's brothers and his family. It was to save and try to reach as many people in Egypt as possible. Salvation, according to the covenant with Abraham, was in you who all of the nations will be blessed. And I have proof of that in the Bible because we're going to read it a little bit later. One man was there to save a nation and his own family and everyone who came there. I thought it was funny because when he sat him down at the table, he put him by their, somebody mentioned that, he put him by their age. You would have known if you were a brother why that was strange, right? How did he know? How did he figure that out? Okay? And by the way, if you think that bigotry and prejudice is something that the United States is modern, it's not. Those verses in chapter 32 prove it. They served him by himself, Joseph. This is the meal, if you read it carefully. And them by themselves, the brothers. And the Egyptians who ate with them by themselves, because why? The Egyptians could not eat with the Hebrews, for that is an abomination to Egyptians. Did you notice that? So to Egyptians, being together on the same table with a Hebrew was an abomination. And in Jesus' day, if you were a Jew, you couldn't sit with anyone else that was a Jew, that was not a Jew, because they were Gentiles. Tell me prejudice started existing nowadays. It's been gone. It's been here forever. So now they saw Hebrews and they can't eat with those guys. I hate to tell you this, but in heaven, the banquet table is non-national and it's not denominational. Everyone will eat at the same table. But it happened even there in Egypt. Go figure. Go figure. Did Joseph want to eat with his brothers? I'm sure he did. But he didn't, because his game was still playing. Okay? So what happens? He gives Benjamin 5 times the amount of food he gives everybody else. Okay? So he feeds everybody, and Benjamin's got this huge thing in front of him now. So then he sends him on his way with grain, right? You know the story. He puts all the money back, but this time he does something else that's strange. What does he do? He puts his own cup. He tells them, put my cup in Benjamin's sack. And then send them on their way. So they go on their way, and as they're on the path, somebody comes running toward them and says, how could you treat us this way? Who stole my master's cup? Now the brothers are indignant, right? We didn't do anything, you know? And so they say this very same words in chapter 44. Should it be found with any of your servants, let him die. This is the brother speaking. If we stole it, whoever stole it, let him die. Boy, oh boy, that was a mistake. Moreover, the rest of us will become my lords and slaves. So they bring them back, And they open all the sacks, and of course, you know who has the cup, right? So now that they said, whoever it is that has it die, I think they're regretting what they said, because that means that Benjamin would have to die. Now what do? So then Joseph says, you know what? I'm not that unfair. Only the one who has the cup will stay with me as my slave. The rest of you can go. Now what happens? Did the brothers learn from what they did to Joseph? Did they grow spiritually? How do you know? Sid.
Based on the reaction to their situation, Reuben was ready to, it was
Judah?
Judah that was ready to take the place of Benjamin and send his back Benjamin back to his dad. He showed the importance of how they had changed.
Whose idea was it to sell Joseph? Who wanted to sell Joseph to the traders when Reuben was gone? It was Judah. So now, and Judah said, what can we say to my Lord? What can we speak? How can we clear ourselves? God has found out the guilt of your servants. What guilt? Here we are, it says, then my Lord, is this my phone that's talking? I hope not. There we are then, my Lord's slaves, both we and also the one whose possession of the cup has been found. So now Judah goes up to Joseph and says what? And I need just to read this one really well. And I put it in blue. I don't know if you can read it well, and I underline it. This is super, super significant. It is my phone. Someone's spying on me. Now, therefore, please let your servant remain. This is Judah talking. Let your servant remain as a slave to my Lord in place of the boy. You get the words that we're talking about here? In place of the boy. Now I'm transporting myself to something Joe said earlier. And let the boy go back with his brothers. For how can I go back to my father if the boy is not with me? I fear to see the suffering that would come upon my father. I don't know about you, but when I read those words, I went to one Bible verse. And it's one that this society coins all the time at sports games, and we know it all the time. John 3:16. For God so loved the world, what? Jesus is the one who says, I am going to go down and die, and I want to let the boy or Elliot or Gloria or everyone go back. Because if I don't return to my Father in heaven without the saved souls, it would break his heart. Judah is literally saying, hey, I can't do this. I will sacrifice myself so that my brother can go back to his father. Did Judah change? He sure did. He sure did. Reuben already sacrificed his sons, right? Reuben already told his father, you know what? If they don't come back, if he doesn't come back, you can kill my kids. I'm going to give of myself to you. Judah says, I'm going to give myself to you instead of him. Everything to defend Benjamin. Oh, there's one. Yeah, here it comes.
The brother dynamic there is amazing to me because they were truthful when they said, we didn't take the cup.
Oh, absolutely.
And then they find out that the little guy did. And they say, how could you do that? He said, but I didn't do it. And they said, but you're a liar. Right?
Well, yeah, how did it get there?
Yeah, that's right. How else could it have got there except you took it?
Yeah.
And yet, in spite of that break in their relationship, there still was a purpose in it.
Yeah. Yeah, I wonder what they thought when they saw it in Benjamin's cup. What do you think ran through their mind? And of all the people that we thought, the youngest one is the one who takes the cup, and now we're in trouble because we said, we even sacrificed him. He said, he can die. The one who took the cup, let him die. Oops. Now what do we do? Bernard.
I think there's also an underlying theme here. It's redemption, it's salvation, reconciliation. All of those things are playing in this scenario. And the most interesting thing about it is that there are 3 versions of the 12 tribes of Israel. There's the original Genesis chapter 49, which literally mentions every single one of them by birth. They are a part of the 12 tribes. When we get to the Exodus, we have the removal of Levi because he's not counted.
Mm-hmm.
By the time we get to Revelation, apparently this is the redemption. This shows who made it. Because at that time, we have the addition of Manasseh, but one individual is removed, and that is Dan.
Mm-hmm.
And we have, it's kind of shocking because we're seeing Reuben, he's a character. He goes and he has incest relationship with his mother and his somewhat mother. Then we have Judah, who's doing all kind of crazy things. But also, if you remember, it was Judah who actually made the suggestion that they sell Joseph over to Egypt.
Yep.
So now we're seeing these 2 characters are emerging as the leaders in their family, and both of them are very flawed individuals. But by the time they get to Egypt, it also explains why they made it to Revelation as salvation and reconciliation, because they truly were repentant. Reuben offers his own children in replacement. Judah says, no, I can't do this.
Yep.
We've got to. It shows that God can save anybody, anybody who really wants to be saved. That's good news.
Yep. Yep. I think, yes, go ahead.
I just wanted to add on the fact that Joseph put that cup in specifically Benjamin's sack. He knew his father. He knew his father, and he wanted to save his father too. I think that it was very intentional that he put the cup in Benjamin because he knows how much Benjamin means to the father. And by the brothers who didn't know, I am assuming their reaction was more like, oh, how could this happen? But the end result was the fact that Joseph really was very intentional. He knew he had the food, and he knew he wanted to save his family, including his father. And the way the story goes on, the whole family is saved to Egypt, which is temporarily, of course, because after the Pharaoh, they become slaves. But at the time, they needed food in that time of those 7 years. So in order to get them, to give them the land they had, he had to use Benjamin, which they would not have understood at the time. But I feel like Joseph knew that. And when, the devastating news would get to the father, either way the result would be salvation. And Joseph knew that. I don't know why else he would put the cup in there. Yeah, I feel like it had a lot to do with his entire family.
Yeah, Joseph Joseph thought this out quite well. He was very deliberate in what he did.
I think it was simply because this was the final act in his plan to determine whether his brothers were actually changed people. If they would be willing to take the place of Joseph, and I think that I don't think that they questioned whether whether Benjamin had actually stolen the cup, because so many other things had happened with the money and the sack being there.
Yep.
This was no surprise to them. And every time they came to Egypt, something unusual happened.
Right.
You know, they went back home with the money that they came with, you know. And for them to be on their way back home, and now there's a cup that nobody, knew about or expected. But again, it was Joseph's plan to see if they were truly loved Benjamin and cared for Benjamin and be willing to give their place to take Benjamin's place.
Yeah.
Which again was a demonstration of the change that had occurred in his brothers. And the very fact that they said, I would kill our father if we didn't come back with this boy. And so because it was again showing that what they had done to Joseph and the suffering that their father had gone through because of that loss, they just did not want him to go through that again. So these brothers are showing how much they care for the father as well. And I think this is what broke Joseph's heart when he finally revealed to them who he truly was.
Yeah, it goes, and our time is up, so I'll wrap this up real quick. But